This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, scholars, essayists, or simply people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. And on our show today, our guest is Dr. Adam Rovner, an associate professor of English and Jewish literature at the University of Denver, and the author of a new book entitled In the Shadow of Zion, Promised Lands Before Israel, was recently published by New York University Press. The book explores the step-siblings of Zionism, 6 different attempts to establish a Jewish political entity in the 19th and 20th centuries, and why they all failed. Hello, Adam. Welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So we're talking about 6 alternative Zions, or alternatives to Zion, all over the world, in upstate New York, in Suriname, in South America, West as well as East Africa, and Australia. And my question to you, perhaps more generally, to start with.
Sure.
How realistic were they, really? Or were they just a pipe dream, all of them?
Well, it's a good question. What I focused on in the book were 6 plans. They weren't just ideas. They weren't just proposals. They were actually plans. All of them had government backing or colonial governmental backing. They had support from Jewish organizations, Jewish nationalist movements. At the time, those were called territorialists. And they also sent out expeditions to each of these places. So, and they published reports. So all of these places that were concerned that you just listed, they all were real and potential areas of actual mass settlement.
Mm-hmm. But only in theory. They never amounted to any concrete plan.
That's right. Only in the case of Kenya, which is popularly known, misknown as the Uganda Plan, did any Jews actually arrive in advance of what they assumed was going to be a mass immigration. In the other places, as you mentioned, in Southwest Africa, Angola, no one came. In Madagascar, no one came. In Tasmania, no one came. In Suriname, no one came during that era, although immediately after World War II, Holocaust survivors did make their way there.
Is that because the Uganda Plan was sanctioned by the Zionist Congress, whereas the others were just ideas of maverick individuals?
Well, I wouldn't call them maverick individuals, but it's a little bit of a complicated thing, but I'll try to clarify. The Zionist Congress did not necessarily support the plan. They supported the sending of an expedition to Kenya. Mm-hmm. And it was very controversial within the Zionist movement. And afterwards, once they made their report in 1905, it split the Zionist Congress. And that was what led Israel Zangwill, who's a famous British author, a British essayist and political figure — we have many streets named after him here in Israel — to leave the Zionist Congress. He was probably Herzl's best friend and biggest supporter at the time. And he just walked out of the Congress, walked out of the Basel offices of the hotel, walked across the street, more or less, and set up a rival conference for territorialism. Mm-hmm. And they took up the idea of East Africa afterwards.
Okay, so before we come back to that, because I have another question about it, can you tell us a bit about the people who came up with the ideas? Who were they?
Sure.
Was there a general profile?
Yeah, and they're kind of the cast of characters of my book. So I wrote the book for general readers. I wrote it in a way that it's a story. Now, we all know how the story ends, but we don't know about these people. And I think that their stories and their efforts, their humanitarian efforts to save or rescue a large part of the Jewish people at various points in history, is an important story that we should remember no matter what we think about Israel in Israel or outside of Israel. It's very important. So you called them mavericks, and I guess that's fairly accurate to some extent. We had, and I'll go in chronological order, a guy by the name of Mordecai Manuel Noah. There's some few streets named after him in Israel. Emmanuel Noach is how he's known in Hebrew. He came up with an idea to create a Jewish mini-state, a sanctuary in an area of upstate New York, which is actually an island between Buffalo and, I guess you'd say, Canada or Toronto. It's right near Niagara Falls. This area, he had purchased land, he had sent out a prospectus, he had given a call, proclamations. There was a whole cornerstone setting ceremony. and no one came. The direct result, really, of anti-settlement efforts by prominent rabbis in France and in England. That was in the 19th century. Then we move up, we see the Kenya Plan, what's known as the Uganda Plan, and that was pioneered by really Theodore Herzl in conjunction with the British statesman Joseph Chamberlain. Then Israel Zangwill took it up after Herzl's death. Angola was pioneered by Zangwill. And Zangwill is a fascinating figure, right? Who's sort of one of the heroes of the book. Then there's Madagascar, which was a plan that was ultimately taken up and perverted by the Nazis during the Holocaust era. But in the pre-war era, it was a joint Polish and French idea which had the support of some in the Jewish community. This was an era of increasing anti-Semitism in Poland, and
we're talking about the eve of the war.
We're talking really in 1937, to be more precise. And so there were a great deal of efforts to try to do something with the Jews who were spilling into Poland's borders as refugees from the Reich, and also Poland had its own homegrown anti-Semitism. They're looking for a way out, and the idea of settlement in Madagascar was this idea that a Jewish territorial movement pioneered. After that, we moved to Tasmania, which is the island state of Australia off the mainland south there. That area, that was an idea that was very interestingly, it was pioneered by a Yiddish writer and editor, an important guy by the name of Melech Ravitch, and later taken up by Isaac Nachman Steinberg, who is probably the other hero of the, or anti-hero, depending on your perspective, of the book. And Isaac Nachman Steinberg was an Orthodox Jew. He was a social revolutionary, and kind of fascinatingly, he had also been a member of Lenin's first Soviet government. And he had this idea to save the Jews. All these people, and he also continued in Suriname, all these people were Jewish humanitarians. They were seeking not just state building, but rescue and then state building.
Okay, so maybe the conclusion is that catastrophic Zionism, as it was known, not the emotional attachment to the idea or the land, but the fact that Zionism was there, or any kind of Jewish homeland was there to save the Jewish masses from persecution, just utterly failed. Even on the eve of the Second World War, it didn't work. So it means that it can't work at all, can it?
Well, the notion of catastrophic Zionism I take up a little bit in the book, and it's a really interesting point. And this is fascinating, I think, for people who are into political science and also Israeli and just wider Jewish history. So we see this odd connection of what we might call catastrophic territorialism, in which these territorialists are saying, we got to do something. The vice of the Reich, the anti-Semitism, the world's collaborators, the gates are shut. We must do something. This is particularly emphasized during the Evian Conference era 38, 39, on the eve of the war. What do we do? This is the Jewish perspective. What do we do? How do we save ourselves? And the two major figures of that era who are really seeing the writing on the wall in ways that are somewhat eerie are Jabotinsky, known for his right-wing militant maximalist Zionism, and we're right off Jabotinsky Street right here, and another guy who doesn't have any streets named after him, who is Isaac Nachman Steinberg. The two of them both saw the coming disaster in ways that are surprising to read today. They saw, if not millions of deaths, and certainly perhaps not the mechanical means by which Jews were destroyed en masse and whole communities wiped out, they certainly saw the dangers posed to the spiritual and physical Jewish people in Europe. And so what Steinberg did was try to find a way out for these Jews, and he wanted to preserve Yiddishkeit, in a sense, whereas Jabotinsky wanted to find a way out and create this Israeli or Hebrew-speaking nation. They actually wrote about one another favorably, shockingly.
So is this really perhaps one of the theoretical differences between Zionism and territorialism, other than the fact that Zion is in one and absent from the other, the fact that territorialism was some sort of continuation of the diaspora, whereas Zionism was a revolutionary endeavor? I
think that you've really hit the nail on the head. And this is my perspective. Other historians may not agree. But I would say if you look back at the records, you look back at letters, you look back at what was written, we really see that in the era in Israel, or what was then British Mandate Palestine, even before under Ottoman Palestine, the state-building effort came before the humanitarian effort. People like Usishkin said so quite clearly, and he was a rival to Herzl. Whereas in the territorialist movement, the humanitarian aim of rescue took primacy. So in Zionism, we might say that under Usishkin, after Herzl's death, he was an important propagator of these notions, that Zionism became a state-building effort primarily, and secondarily, or maybe tertiary, a humanitarian effort, where the territorialists always maintained a humanitarian effort first and state building second.
Yeah, and I'd like to know whether the Zionists, the Zionist Congress, and those who were actively Zionists, were they ever threatened by territorialism? Were they on a par, equally powerful at some point?
Also a good question, and something that's forgotten. The territorialists, for a significant part of the early 20th century, probably had a lot more sway on what we might call the Jewish street than did the Zionists. Partially, we can see the results of this in the United States, into the great deal of immigration that came from Tsarist Russia, from the Pale of Settlement into the U.S. in those early years. I think immigration to the U.S. peaked around 1907 or something, 1908 in raw numbers. What we see is that the territorialists under Zangwill very shrewdly created agencies to give information out to potential immigrants in the Pale of Settlement. And they had hundreds of offices, where the Zionists did not have that kind of organization on the ground in the Pale. And those they did have, they were very selective about who they allowed into what was then Ottoman Palestine, or who they encouraged to come, I guess we could say. A historian in University of Haifa, Gur Aroi, is a very good historian. He's documented this a great deal, and I'm sort of drawing on his work here when I point out to that. But beyond that, the Zionists were clearly threatened by the territorialists as a rival group, at least for some periods of time. They attacked, especially Usishkin, the territorialists at every corner they could. Usishkin sent out speakers to attack. Borborchov was one of his emissaries to attack this plan throughout, Yiddish-speaking, Hebrew-speaking, whatever, Russia and the Pale, throughout Eastern and Central Europe. So they were rival groups, and only later did the territorialists really attack the Zionists.
So when was really the watershed? When did the tide start turning?
Towards Zionism?
Towards Zionism.
I think we could say that Zionism becomes a much more of a mass movement in the 1920s. We start really seeing that build up, and maybe in the immediate post-World War I era, there's a lot of displacement. I mean, people came to what was then Ottoman Palestine and then left. But certainly, without a doubt, I think everyone would agree that in the run-up to World War II in the 1930s, when we had mass amounts of German refugees coming to Israel, we really start seeing Zionism as an ideology and as an established fact on the ground, with the flourishing of Tel Aviv, for example, as a turning point.
To what extent is that thanks to the British Empire fostering Zionism after it occupied Palestine?
Well, the British played one group off the other for decades, the Arabs against the Jews, Jews against the Arabs. And so while there was a one hand that was giving and supportive, another hand was taking away and was frustrating these state-building efforts. Trying to maintain this odd status quo in which no one was happy was more or less the British policy. And you see if you go into the parliamentary records, which I've done, you see people who are pro-Jewish who are asking the British government to let in more Jews in the immediate pre-war era, and the British government having a policy of saying no. Yet,
those plans to settle Tasmania and Madagascar all during the same time utterly failed.
They did utterly fail. I think they failed for a number of reasons. One, they failed because the people who were supporting them, these individuals, especially Steinberg, for example, even Zangwill to an extent, they placed their faith in individuals within a governmental system. They didn't really understand, perhaps, or fully understand or appreciate the nature of bureaucracies and of differences within a government itself, of the pros and cons, the various opposing forces. So when they did get support from important people, they thought that support was going to necessarily lead to success with individuals. For example, with Chamberlain, let's say, or when Isaac Nachman Steinberg had two governors of territories in Australia, states, actually support his plan in Tasmania and in Western Australia. But that didn't necessarily mean that they were going to actually have the funding, et cetera, to move this forward. There was also the sense of historical events. World War I interrupts, to a large extent, the plan to settle Angola, once the Portuguese government had already approved it. World War II interrupts the plan to settle Western Australia, which I only discussed to some extent in my book. And Tasmania is interrupted more or less by a tragic death by one of the principals who had a great deal of political connections in Tasmania. Not Steinberg, but a man who Steinberg worked with. And thirdly, none of these places really caught the imagination of the Jewish masses.
So maybe that's really the bottom line here, that it's just the gravitational pull of Zion, of the promised land, that thanks to it, the entire project of Jewish nationalism took off. Maybe those places that you discussed, those lands, were just not promised enough.
I think that that is absolutely a part of the story here. We just don't see the level of commitment to a religious or sentimental, emotional attachment to the land of Israel. We just don't see that when it comes to, say, Madagascar or East Africa. Now, people tried in the Zionist Congress. They tried to make the case, for example, that the Rift Valley, which begins in East Africa, which begins actually in the area where they planned Jewish settlement, was just a continuation of Greater Israel, which is even more maximalist a position than Jabotinsky would take. But those sort of practical matters of trying to settle a place to get Jews out, sadly, perhaps in the sense of saving people's lives, did not come to pass.
One last question, perhaps anecdotal, but is this really an exhaustive study of alternatives to Zion? Because one glaring absence is perhaps the most high-profile example, Birobidzhan, that attempt to set up a Jewish Soviet republic in the Russian Far East. Why didn't you not include it in your book?
Right, and I'm glad you bring this up. It always lets me say this. First of all, no study is exhaustive. I would not claim that for my own. I picked these 6 because I could see a historical connection between them. Each of these plans, besides being actual plans and besides being the object of a commission of scientific study, were all promoted by a literary figure to some extent, an editor, a journalist, a writer, a fiction writer, an intellectual man of letters in these cases. And Birobidzhan, while it did have the supporters of many intellectuals, men of letters, and especially in the Yiddish writing, Birobidzhan comes out of a different sort of family tree. It is, according to some scholars, launched as a kind of cynical Stalinist response to Zionism and was not territorialism per se. The territorialists themselves distanced their organizations from the Birobidzhan efforts, mostly because by the 1930s, many of those involved in territorialism, including Steinberg himself, had a very negative reaction to the Soviet policies, and they understood in a way that many people in the U.S. and Canada, for example, did not, that Birobidzhan was more of a ploy, was a Potemkin village of some kind, and never really took off.
So they thought that they realized that the Soviet Union was essentially anti-Jewish and weren't willing to allow them to fulfill their national aspirations?
Certainly Steinberg did, and he distanced himself from that. And under his watch, the territorialist movement, the Freeland League is what it was called, really kept themselves at arm's length from Birobidzhan. They were happy to see Jews flourishing and living, but they didn't come outright and criticize it, but in their internal documents and even in some of their publications. They were very skeptical, we might say, of it. So it's not an exhaustive list. I made my decisions to pick places that had a connection with one another, that were actual plans, had a scientific commission, and that were led by figures from literature of some way, because I do come from literature. And then I went to all these places to do research, to see the actual sites. And I think that also allowed me to visualize them as more than abstract paper states, but as actual potentials. And in some cases, especially in Suriname and in Kenya, I really was able to see the fertility of the land and the possibilities of some kind of state-building effort could have made there.
Yeah, well, but history is what happens when Jews are making other plans. By the way, another flagrant omission in your book of a Jewish nation state is, of course, the Upper West Side in Manhattan, but we'll leave that for another discussion. Adam Rovner, Associate Professor of English and Jewish Literature at the University of Denver and author of In the Shadow of Zion, Promised Land Before Israel. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you for having me, Gilad.
And this brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Vanish, the technical producer of this show. I am Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
Everybody's going to find a way.